All right, welcome everyone. This is going to be the final lecture of Unit 3. We're getting there. The final unit in general will focus on economics. I've really tried to hit this section on sort of human rights and democracy and sort of high level political stuff. And then we'll hit some economic stuff in the next section, and we'll talk about sort of China trying to move into the area. All right. So this final paper, which I thought was excellent, and after reading it, I was like, wow, we've hammered on a lot of this stuff, you know. So I'll take kind of a broad overview, but I think it's really great to see what a real scientific article looks like, to have to pick through it, to see the way that they present their information, right? Always be meta thinking about like, how does the writing look? How do they approach things? You'll notice there's a whole lot of like first, second, third, fourth, or here's a list of four things, or these sorts. And I usually lean toward econometric publications, but this was a really good theory paper. And a lot of you don't really have a background in econometrics, so I thought this was an excellent high level because international politics is a really fantastic journal, right? Like probably in the second tier, maybe like the first quadrant, but not the gold standard, right? Okay, so the paper is Oil Dependency and Democratic Outcomes in the Middle East, a comparative analysis of resource-rich and resource-poor states, right? And this is by Julian Miao, which is just such a cool name, from King's College in London. And I did a little research. It looked like graduated from Cambridge, later moved to King's College. All right, we'll skip through the abstract. I'll hit the intro section pretty hard. So we've talked a lot about this stuff, but I think it's really good to sort of read over it, build an understanding of these big theories so that you can apply them to the little cases, right? So this really focuses on two different arguments in the political science realm about developing states or resources and how they affect governance, right? And so we have rentier states, which we've sort of hammered on in class. These are the oil and petroleum states, sort of a subset of like the resource states, right? Or the resource export states, whatever you might want to call it. And then we have the foreign dependent states. And we talked a bit about this in my former policy class, and I've touched on it in some other classes. But the problem with foreign dependency and humanitarian aid is again, I'll say I think they're like come from a morally good place. Like we're trying to help people and all these things. But from an economist's perspective, what happens is you sever the incentive for improvement, right? You sever the need to collect taxes, you sever the connection to your voting base, you sever any accountability because even if you screw up, like the West is just going to throw money at you. There are, high levels of potential for corruption and bribery and graft and sort of just theft of the donor dollars. So there are a lot of problems with foreign assistance and then how it affects leaders' incentive structures about change and reform or just sort of ossify and pay off, right? All right. I also wanted to point out that, part of the point of the chapter is that these states sort of solidify, right? And especially rentier states, because there's, as we'll read along, there's more differentiation in the foreign aid states, right? Lebanon is an absolute collapsing disaster. Jordan has some potential for democracy, though it's not a democracy. Um, but on the other hand, the Kuwait, UAE, Saudi Arabias of the world all operate pretty similarly, right? And they have the same outcomes. But I do want to point out that, the modernization theory says we're going to move from developing to middle to full democratic capitalist state, right? But wealth, once you pass a certain point, like we've talked about in Jaworski, it just stabilizes autocracies too. And so, like, this was the theory that if we opened up China to trade, it would bring up all boats, it would build a middle class, there would be a giant protest eventually, and China would collapse into a democracy and play with the West like a loving partner or something, right? But again, it was a pretty utopian because China just got wealthy and used that wealth and influence to further repress their society. So try to avoid the idea that just having resources around is going to inevitably lead to democracy, right? There are a couple reasons here. Again, the severance of taxes and sort of the accountability between citizen and state. You have a very highly centralized authority, right? Because all of the money is flowing through a single industry, which makes the economy far easier to take control of than a highly diversified and sectorized economy with leaders in each section and all these things, right? You also get this sort of wealth dependency and the grand bargain argument, right? About we're just putting out a whole bunch of social spending and, it'll keep people from getting grumpy, and it'll allow us to focus on the ones who like really get out of hand, right? And then I want to add a few things that the author Meow did not cover. I think that it increases a lot of the bribery stuff, right? It increases co-optation. Again, when you don't really have a diversified economy, it's really hard to just pay off. I mean, when you don't have a diversified economy, it's very easy to just pay off the few leaders who are running, or to just expropriate it, right, and run it yourself. That's a lot harder to do in a highly, highly diversified economy. You get increased resources for military spending, repression, policing, surveillance, all of these sorts of things as rentier states, which also increases their power. And because the West really needs oil and energy inputs, they don't hold rentier states to the same accountability and even help them to sort of quell some frustrations in their population sometimes. And so you're also not getting as much pressure externally as you would from other states without these resources. They touch on a couple of the weaknesses of the theory, which we've talked about actually, right? Market fluctuations and how they affect governance and the likelihood of being able to stay in power. The need to diversify assets, which is a pretty deep discussion in this paper. And then the international need for energy. And yes, we're trying to transition, and it looks like the Iran war may have been the tipping point in this transition calculus that leaders are making. And we're seeing like just billions, maybe trillions of dollars thrown at green over the last 6 months. Um, but there is still a need for energy. Okay, so really what the paper is trying to do is meld these ideas about the rentier state and how sort of internal and external factors work and the foreign aid dependent state and how they work and what we can learn about sort of tying them together and trying to build a grand unified theory of statecraft in the Middle East, maybe something like that, right? And they really are looking at from 2000 to the present, when there was a big shift post 9/11. I'm going to skip the lit review. I'm going to jump right into the case studies because we've done a lot of the big theory stuff. So I wanted to dive deep into the couple of case studies and some interesting things that I read. Uh, okay, section 3A.1 export dependency and market diversification. So, yes, as we've discussed, the Saudis and other states like UAE, Kuwait, etc., have all been trying to diversify their asset holdings but not their labor market, right? Not their internal economy, which is an important point because they are trying to be able to weather the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of commodities markets, right? By spreading their wealth elsewhere and being able to at least minimize the pain when oil prices are low. Um, but they're not trying to actually like build an economy per se, right? Even all the giant projects that they build, which they'll talk about later in the paper, with backing from China under the One Belt One Road policy, the OBOR, are giant like port projects and stuff, which don't create a lot of jobs. The jobs they do create tend to be foreign workers, and it's not really helping, the broader economy. It's just making like bigger ships be able to pull into ports in Saudi Arabia, etc., or improving the efficiency of getting raw crude onto boats, like these sorts of things. But they're not really trying to build out other industries. And Kuwait's even worse, which we'll talk about. They say 85% of their labor force is in the public sector, which is insanity, right? Okay, so why are they trying to diversify? Of course, it gives them more power. It gives them the ability to sort of swing their weight around in different sectors in the global market. And if if you try to diversify your economy rather than your assets, that starts to build the power of individual citizens relative to the state. And so they just want asset diversification, not labor diversification. Secondly, I think that like education and critical thinking are vital to real labor and diversified economies, which is why we've seen that like throwing money at things like education return some of uh, the best payoffs for a state over time. So Japan, South Korea, others like that, Uruguay, and then many European nations. But education also means critical thinking, right? And there are hard controls in the Middle East about education, how long you can be educated, whether women or men should receive the same education, how much critical thinking should we be teaching, like all of these sorts of things. Mhm. Oh, also, as we touched on women in politics in the Middle East last time, often what we see as sort of a broader economic trend is that when you start to diversify your economy and your economy really starts to sort of build that snowball effect, and you have a high need for labor input, oftentimes that opens up space for women to enter the market and a further liberalization of gender roles in society. And there are questions about whether the Middle East sort of wants to play that game, particularly in specific countries. I think Saudi Arabia is definitely one of them. Kuwait's a little bit more liberalized, but some spots on that map are there are questions about how much they want women to be part of markets, education, etc. Let's see. Oh, and then finally, when we touched on it, if you have a diversified economy, you can't just bribe everyone, right? If there's only like two or three sectors, it's a lot easier, but it doesn't really work that way in like a European westernized economy. At least from up until this point, there are questions in places right now about whether um, I don't know, certain industries have gained outsized power, and maybe it is making it easier to bribe and corrupt these sorts of questions. But historically, it was pretty difficult to do that in a diversified economy. Okay, we'll move on to Kuwait. Kuwait is, like I said, they're a little bit more diversified, and they purportedly want to continue to diversify. They have been making changes over time, especially the last decade or so. It's a teeny, teeny, teeny little tiny state. And so they have a very small population and very small borders. They don't really have the same problems as some of the other states, like, say, Saudi Arabia, right? And they had heavy influence in the 1990s and 2000s, which I was kind of surprised the author didn't mention too much of, when Iraq attacked Kuwait, right, to get access to their oil fields, and the U.S. backed Kuwait, and used Kuwait as a strategic spot on the map, and sort of battered back Iraq during the what was it, Desert Storm in, I think it was 1993. And so the U.S. has had a little bit more leeway to push Kuwait to liberalize a little bit, and they've been willing to sort of do so. They still have a monarchical democracy. I don't know how that works, but it has opened up. Let's see. Yeah, again, Kuwait isn't really a democracy, but their quote unquote legislative body does have more power than the monarch, say, in than the, say, legislative body in Saudi Arabia under their monarch, right? Kuwait does have a monarchy, and the dude does control a lot of stuff, right? But there is growing space for voices. There's less repression of women, these sorts of things. But there are problems like abuse of immigration and labor, these sorts of things. All right, let's move to section 3A.2, welfare systems and social stability. In Saudi Arabia, so this is like the heart of the grand bargain from the last paper we wrote. And the idea is that there's broad safety nets. Saudi Arabia offers free healthcare, free education. If you live in the cities, they're gleaming and brand new generally. There's very high sort of, per capita, especially relative to the region. And so, the idea here is that you're severing this connection between the citizen and you're basically just quelling any frustrations they might have by buying them off rather than creating a society by which they can sort of provide their own or at least a bigger chunk, right? This leaves states in a very strange spot sometimes. So, again, the disconnect between citizen and state because you're not relying on taxes and these. There's really no accountability. You get really high expenditures. So, big proportions of, and this is kind of the US too, so I should make that point, but huge proportions of the budget are focused on these handouts, right? And this, the way I see it as being a little bit similar to the U.S., or this U.S. being similar to them, is, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. I mean, this is eating up 50% or more of our budget. And it's basically just for the very elderly, who we know are the most likely group to vote and a growing group over time, and usually the very poor, which is a large voting bloc in the United States. Even though they don't turn out in the same percentages, they, it's a huge segment of our population. And so these high government expenditures can cause problems with your deficit, especially if commodities markets are down. It can cause problems with currency, especially if, of course, if you're not pinned to the US dollar. Most of them are in that part of the world. But it can cause real issues with your sort of the value and the costs of food and products in your society. And when you're stuck at the dollar, but your purchasing power is declining, right? It leads to questions about whether the IMF or the World Bank or private lenders, these sorts of things, will be willing to lend money to states like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait. Yes, they have oil reserves, and yes, they're profitable most of the time, but things could turn rather quickly, right? And there are questions about whether if you're dropping 70% of your entire budget during good times on social spending to keep your citizens happy, and suddenly the price of oil collapses down to $60 a barrel, and now suddenly all those same payouts you were making are 120% of your budget, right? And now there are questions whether you're going to be able to actually pay back those loans. Talked about all that. Oh, the final point I would make is that we are seeing a turn to green and renewable energy, and China is dominating that market. And the Middle East and America, in a sense, are not moving in that direction. We're fighting that direction, actually. And that's not going to really do us well in the long run, and it's not going to do the Middle East well in the long run, because the more that the world can start providing its own renewable energies through solar or tidal waves or geothermal or whatever it might be, and that means the less they're going to want oil, right? And a few states are just going to start gleaming as the only oil states left. They're going to start getting sort of humiliated on the international scene. The price of oil is going to start to collapse as demand collapse. This could lead to major problems, especially in that region. All right, Kuwait kind of has the same deal. It's not exactly the same setup, but they are very similar. And the statistic that really popped out to me was that 85% of nationals in Kuwait are public sector workers. I cannot imagine what a sort of democratic response would be to 85% of sort of eligible citizens working for the federal government. That's crazy. Uh, and it just sort of shows you what I was talking about as we introduced this class, is that sometimes these are just fake jobs. Like, you just go around and twiddle your thumbs at work, or sometimes you don't even really have to show up, kind of thing. Yeah. All right, section 3A.3, political reform and external factors. Here, I think it's important to know that Saudi Arabia plays both sides, right? Saudi Arabia very, very much wants sort of the protection of the United States and access to their military equipment and more, right? Because I think they see themselves as the regional hegemon. They really only see Iran as a potential rival for that position. And so they see that the US despises Iran, and they've built this sort of Sunni, Saudi led US coalition against Shia, Iran, etc. However, they also play both sides of the fence, because China also pumps a bunch of money into their system and is the biggest purchaser of Saudi Arabia's oil. And while the US has incentives to sort of have regional stability, have geopolitical and geostrategic positions in the Middle East with military bases, etc., wants to build an alliance system through sort of the Abraham Accords, right? However, China doesn't give a shit about any of that. Like, let's just be real. What China wants is access to oil, strategic ports for their One Belt One Road sea strategy, and critical mineral access, that kind of stuff, if they can find it in the region, right? But they're not really all that interested in democracy or human rights or any of that kind of stuff. Arguably, the United States isn't either. Um, but they have a very different perspective of what they want out of the relationship. And Iran has been smart to play both sides, to sort of keep them separate, to not send big signals when they're seeing one or the other, unless they're, it's unless it's some big like handshaking event or something like that, right? But they're not trying to create a combative relationship. In some sense they almost see themselves as an interlocutor between U.S., China, energy all this kind of stuff. Okay. Um, Okay, we'll just move on to Kuwait. Kuwait focuses a lot more on foreign direct investment. So this is the idea that foreign investors or investment funds or hedge funds or whatever will buy either whole companies or chunks of companies in foreign states, right? And foreign direct investment is highly vaunted and highly sought after, especially by developing and middling states, but you could even see Trump out there, like, oh, look, we've got $5 trillion in investment from Taiwan, and here's another trillion from Japan. And I mean, who knows if those projects are ever going to really pan out? But you can see the the draw, right? Not only does it boost your economy, it looks like you're a great politician and you're bringing jobs home and like all these kind of things. So yeah, foreign direct investment can be good. And on the other side, the investors themselves tend to see, especially in developing and middling markets, if you get it right, the profitability will far exceed what you can find in the West. I guess unless you're outside AI or Dollar General at this point now. Um, but it draws foreign direct investors to try to find a sweet spot in a place on Earth that is growing in capacity and has need for these things and has further stability moving forward. There's a lot that goes into it. So Kuwait has attracted a lot of foreign direct investment. They don't really need um, they really don't need aid, like we're going to talk about in the next section, but they've also been thoughtful about trying to actually attract some business instead of just doing asset diversification. And again, they're a little bit more liberalized and open than Saudi Arabia, so that makes sense theoretically. All right, next section. You know what? I'm going to call it there and I'll do resource scarce next. Oh, you know what? I don't have very many more notes. One more page. Okay, resource scarce sections. Jordan and Lebanon external aid and governance is section 4.1. So Jordan got about $4 billion in aid in 2022. This tends to be sort of year on year. I should have went and checked if any of that got severed after the USAID. I don't know, what do you call it, detenting, like just taking down the whole thing. So I don't really know actually on this year, and I'll be frank about that. But generally, we'll put money into Jordan, especially to first signal that we think they're doing pretty well in that region, right? And we want the rest of you to look more like this. They also think that it helps the U.S. and the West. Think it helps regional stability to have someone functioning in that area who's not just, say, Israel. And there was a massive influx of refugees coming in from Syria during the Syrian civil war. And in a sense, these payouts were to ensure that Syria would take them in. I mean, not Syria, that Jordan would take in these Syrian refugees and feed and clothe and assimilate them into their population, etc., rather than them sort of flooding into Europe, right? They wanted to stop to sort of stanch the movement before they got to Greece or further north in the European continent. And so this was a really heavy part of why some of this money was going over there without them really saying that out loud in many senses. In 2018, Jordan passed some tax reforms. They added some what's called value added taxes. This is how most of the world does taxation. They also put in consumption taxes, like it would be almost like our sales taxes here. These were highly regressive, just like sales taxes are, right? Um, the idea here is that if you're a millionaire and you go out to buy food and food prices are increasing, you're not going to notice much, right? But if you only make $20,000 this year and food prices are increasing, it's going to start to affect you. And it's going to hit you way harder as a proportion of your income than it ever would someone who's wealthy, right? And that's why these are called regressive taxes, even though they're quote unquote flat, right? Like everyone pays the same rate. But that's not how we think about them in economics, right? And so these tended to hit the lower and middle classes very hard. And there was some pushback during that time. But in a sense, it was a way for them to try to at least reconnect their taxation service and, in some sense, collect from the black market somehow. And that's a difficult thing because we've talked about multiple times in this course is that there are huge black markets in some of these places, at the bazaars, sort of informal women markets. Drug markets, because opium is coming out of Afghanistan, all kinds of different stuff. All right. We talked about why aid can be problematic. I already kind of covered that. I'm going to skip that. I would say Lebanon is far worse. Lebanon is a bit of a nightmare situation, one of the worst on the planet at the moment, maybe outside of, I don't know, Democratic Republic of Congo. They have crippling debt. They're getting hammered by Israel all the time. They have insanely high unemployment levels. I mean, we're talking about like above 50% for many demographics, especially young people. They have currency collapse issues all the time. Their currency is not really worth anything. And the more you pump in foreign dollars, the less your currency becomes worth. Like it doesn't make sense in a lot of senses. Some regions rely heavily on Hezbollah, who is, I guess, like a proxy military slash humanitarian group. Like, I don't even know. I feel like I struggle with it, and the West struggles with this idea of groups like Hamas and Hezbollah and why people in the region have respect for them and stuff. Because all we from the West see is all their sort of violent terrorism and jihadism, and um, but they also are smart to provide things like social services, right? Food distribution programs, nurse programs, education, like all of these sorts of things that try to clean up their image, and arguably, like some of those folks want to provide those social goods because their government is not, right? The Palestinian government is not providing social goods, it's not really providing anything. The same thing is going on in Lebanon, right? Like the government is completely dysfunctional. It is like religiously fractioned. There's ethnic tensions, there's corruption and theft. Even the social goods that do get doled out are only doled out through our ethnic group kind of thing. Like, there are so many problems here. And it's become this sort of playground for Iran versus Israel, which just makes the problem worse. Okay, well, that's enough. Thank you so much for being here. I really just wanted to sort of hit on some actual case studies and then give you a nice broad review of how these things mix together. So, I appreciate you being here. I will get the next, I guess, Unit 3 paper up probably today, but maybe tomorrow on Sunday. All right. Have a great day.